I thought I was going to be pulling up the last one, and I was the one going to be standing between you and your evening and your beers, but thankfully I'm not in that position. So I can relax a little bit, I think. Cool. All right. Yeah, my name's Jeff. I'm coming from Delivery Hero and really just going to be providing a little bit different perspective today because we, Delivery Hero is about 10 years old. The sustainability function is only about 2 years old. So we are still in our infancy. I'm going to be sharing a little bit in terms of what the new kid on the block is trying to do in and amongst this very dynamic landscape. There we go. Dynamic landscape of ever-changing regulations and interest in moving in terms of becoming either climate neutral or net zero. So yeah, climate action moving at speed. Maybe just introduction. I'm not sure how many of you have food delivery apps on your phone and order food when you are tired at the end of the day, or you just getting your kids to bed and you just want to get a pizza. How many people order food on their phone? Cool. And how many people know Food Panda? All right, so we have a couple. Great. All right, so Delivery Hero is a food delivery company, predominantly providing food from restaurants, but also food from grocery stores increasingly now. So we operate in about 50 different countries across the world. We have around 30,000 employees. And we deliver, I think in the first half of the year, we delivered around just under 1.5 billion orders. So very large. I think outside of China, we're one of the largest food delivery companies in the world. But also we're a house of brands. People aren't going to recognize Delivery Hero, but you might recognize Food Panda. If you're from the Nordics, Foodora is the other brand. And in the Middle East, Talabat is also one of our really big brands. So, and in terms of the journey, as I mentioned, like I was brought on board in early 2019 to really kind of build out the sustainability program. So we haven't really been doing this for very long. And what we started looking at was in 2018, we'd started thinking about, right, we need to start doing some measurement. And when I came on, it was then saying, right, where are we going to go from here? And what we now have is at least some priorities across the sustainability space of what we want to try to achieve. So we call these our 4 big bets. So climate action, plastic and packaging, rider and worker welfare, and hunger. So maybe just spend maybe 1 minute just unpacking some of this. I know that this conference is really about around climate action, but I think the really big issue that we also face is packaging. So every single thing that is ordered on the platform is going to have to go into some item. Almost all of that packaging is going to be oil-based plastic, but it also contributes to waste. And so what we're looking at trying to do is how do we actually try to get restaurants to use a better type of packaging that will address and reduce waste, but it also will have a climate impact. So we see kind of big links between these first two pillars, climate action and sustainable packaging. But also we have hundreds of thousands of riders who deliver food for us to the customers. So keeping them safe, ensuring they have good working conditions, that's the other really big area for us. And then we are, food is about what we do. And so kind of we saw a really good synergy with the World Food Program. And so we have a really big focus on hunger as well. And I think the one plug I will give you is that anyone who is using Food Panda in Germany, you can donate a meal after you do your order. So just keep an eye out of that. That was one of the things we were introducing on the platform. So I'm here to really talk about climate action today. And as I said, we're in our infancy. So for us, we are still measuring our global footprint. As of right now, I cannot tell you what our global footprint is. By the end of March, I will. And so the first thing that we're doing is the basics. We are measuring. We want to be data driven, and I'll talk a little bit more in terms of how we're actually trying to do that. But we're taking a slightly different approach than the traditionalist, where you would measure, reduce, and offset. We wanted to look at actually how do we address these emissions as fast as possible while we try to take the time to solve for reduction, because we know that trying to figure out how we can scale out sustainable packaging to tens of billions of items and how we start to roll out zero delivery emissions across millions of orders, that's going to take some time for us to figure out in 50 different markets. So what do we do about the impact that we're having on the climate until then? And that's why we've kind of taken a slightly different approach in our program and say, right, we're going to measure. Once we get some clarity in terms of what our footprint is, we're then going to offset that, and then we'll roll out the reduction activities over time. So that's kind of the way that we're doing that. We also know that offsetting has a bit of a checkered past. And so that was one of the challenges that we were starting to get when we spoke to people about this, is saying, well, hold on, kind of, how can you tell us that you're just going to do offsetting? Is that just not going to be, you're going to stop there? And how do we know that you're going to continue on to reduction? And really, I think it's a fair challenge, but it's also a sign of a lack of trust in business. So I think what we wanted to do is be guided by the right principles from this on the beginning. So one is kind of making sure that we are trying to be authentic. We aren't just doing this to look good. We actually want to try to make a difference. The other thing is needing to be data-driven. We're not going to start estimating our footprint and then buying offsets or trying to reduce without knowing where the data is. So hence kind of taking a regional rollout, which I'll talk through in a moment. And then also being transparent. So we publish our methodology that's available for people to interrogate and challenge on our website. And then finally, it is relying on the experts. So again, I can talk a little bit more later in terms of how we do the offsetting. And we don't really use the open market. We go through specific partners. Balancing speed and quality. So we wanted to go from trying to be having done almost nothing 2.5 years ago to trying to see how fast we can go to being carbon neutral globally. And I think kind of the key thing here is I was asked, like, right, can you be carbon neutral, or can we make the business carbon neutral by the end of 2019? I was like, no, we need to make sure that we actually are able to know what our emissions are so that we can do that in the right way. And so we're rolling this out on a regional basis. So we measured Europe in 2019, having refined the methodology further from the first year it was done. In 2020, we rolled this out to Latin America. And this year, we're in the process of now measuring our 2 largest regions, which is the Middle East and Asia Pacific. And what we aim to do is at the end of each year that we measure, we then offset those emissions across the operations. So we were having a joke about this actually in the break, how many people actually know scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Curious about that? Little hands raised. Everyone knows them? Okay, good. So the joke was that I could not have to go into detail on this because most people would know about it. And some of the people I was speaking with saying, well, I don't know, maybe that's an assumption. So I'm just going to, I won't go into the detail on this, but I'll just say there's 2 things. We split our emissions in really 2 big categories. One is corporate emissions and one is delivery emissions. And this slide's just outlining kind of what we categorize within our corporate emissions. And it actually goes across all scope 1, 2, and 3. And I would say out of these, our scope 1 and 2 are very, very tiny for our business. And within our corporate emissions, what we see is the biggest emissions coming out of our procurement activities. So just this kind of box here on the far right, kind of restaurant hardware, those are the kits that the restaurants receive your order when you send it in. So kind of the emissions that come from the production of those units, shipping them over to the restaurants, for example. This is what we're measuring on an annual basis collecting this data from each of the markets. A lot of this information will come straight from the market, so a lot of data to be collecting. But where most of the emissions will come from, no surprises, from the delivery emissions. And the way that we've set out the methodology for measuring these emissions is really looking at the 2 big drivers of that, which is the packaging itself, but also then the emissions from the delivery and the transport. So what we don't consider is, say, the emissions from food. And the reason that we don't do that is that those emissions would have occurred anyway. There's no change from us being a business. And similarly, the cooking of the food. So if you were to go into the restaurant, that food would have been cooked. If you were to eat at home and cook that food yourself, there would have been emissions from that. So again, no change. And then we don't also consider the energy from devices because it's actually quite negligible. We did look into that. But the emissions from packaging and transport, they're quite considerable. And really the emissions from packaging will come from the embedded emissions in its manufacturing, the transport to the restaurant, and then its end-of-life disposal. And because of those are mostly oil steel-based plastic, kind of it has a lot of embedded emissions relative to, say, bagasse, which is more, that's your kind of compostable packaging, which will have a very small amount of embedded emissions relative to plastic. And interestingly, these two are actually almost side by side in terms of their same amount. So when we look at it on a per order basis, they're roughly equal. How do we offset the emissions? I mean, I think there's no rocket science here, particularly for this crowd at a conference like this. I mean, what we do is actually, just because we're a small team and we are in the early stages of our journey, it was trying to do it as simple as possible, which is we do it through a single partner. That also helps us manage some of the risk that might be presented through offsetting projects for our brands, by being able to say, right, we can trust a single partner. We can assess their quality controls in terms of the quality of the projects themselves. So we offset currently through our partner South Pole. We have those 4 projects which are covering the emissions from our Latin American and European businesses, and each year we look at a kind of a portfolio of projects that we would be wanting to include, and we use a range of criteria. So price, obviously a very big driver, but also which regions they come from, which technologies they are, and which SDGs they fulfill. So as you can see, we actually kind of each criteria we try to aim for, but some will be more important than others. So for these set of projects, we clearly did not differentiate our technologies since they're all energy based, but I think that's certainly something that we're aiming to do a little bit more in the future. I think the key thing here, and again, it's I would say how dynamic this area is how much things have changed in 2 years. So when we were looking at this in 2019, it was looking at, right, how do we go fast to carbon neutrality, and really the debate is even further now to how do you go even farther towards being net zero. And I think for us, we knew this in a way was coming. We know what we have to do. We have to address packaging and we have to address delivery. And for us, it's now about investing into those new pathways. So it's how do we transition tens of billions of orders and items of packaging over to something like bagasse, and the challenges there is to convince restaurants, who are the ones that actually choose to buy the packaging and use the packaging. How do we convince them to change the supplier they've been buying packaging from for a decade? How do we get them to use something they maybe haven't used before that looks really different? How do we overcome the myths that they might have, which is that, oh, this kind of funny looking type of packaging that you can't see through is going to actually hold the soup as securely as a plastic packaging that I've used for the last 10 years as well. So it's kind of trying to convince these restaurants to do that, and doing that at scale. So across those 50 markets, across those millions of orders. So that's the challenge that we're looking at trying to roll out over the coming years. And then equally on deliveries, so there are 4 main methods that food is delivered. One will be by bike, one will be by car, one will be by moped, and crazy enough, some are done by walking. Usually in cities where there's a really high population density, but even that surprised me, having a walking delivery. And so what we're then having to look at is, how do we transition more deliveries over to, say, bikes? Bike is very common, is actually the main way that we deliver here in Germany. But actually, how do we transition more over to that while still being able to achieve fast deliveries that deliver a good customer experience? And that there's a bit of a trade-off there. So the other option is then, how do we electrify some of the transport? And in certain markets, say in the Middle East, where cars are more commonly used because of the distances traveled and the temperatures, how do we convince riders or drivers who may not have a huge amount of disposable income to invest into an electric vehicle? What are the mechanisms and the incentives that we can use to be able to help them do that? So again, that we know that these are the areas that we need to focus on, but we also know that's going to take time, and hence the reason why we wanted to try to address the emissions in some way while we were trying to do that. So that is all I have for you. Happy to discuss and take any questions when we get into the roundtable session.